Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. Full disclosure, this is now the third official time I've attempted to film this video. My mic keeps deciding that it does not have to be a participant, so we've been going through it this morning, but you know what? We're gonna keep going anyway. I would like to take this time to invite any of my fellow tree hugging snowflakes out there to go ahead and grab whatever drink is going to bring you some comfort here. I've got my coffee and my dumpster fire mug, which dumpster fire is so accurate for many things right now. But we're definitely going to need some comfort because today we're talking about the final decision made by the Bureau of Land Management to officially rescind the public lands rule. Now, we are going to read through the Associated Press article talking about this, but I have read this ahead of time and I've taken notes. So we're going to be taking pauses and we're going to be talking about my thoughts, and they are more together this time than they usually are when we read articles together. So, yay. But before we dive in, I do want to invite anyone who has any thoughts to please put them down into the comment section below. I do genuinely enjoy reading thoughtful and sometimes not so thoughtful comments. If you find any value at all with this video, please consider giving it a like and also consider sharing this one. I don't always ask people to do that, but I do think that the information in this particular video is important, especially for anybody who cares about protecting public lands and the environment and all that jazz. And also, if you want to see more of me and my content recommended to you, consider clicking that subscribe button. I would actually really appreciate it. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. As I said before, the article that we're going to read together is from the Associated Press. It is titled Trump Administration Cancels Rule That Made Conservation a Use of Public Lands. And honestly, as far as headlines go, titles, whatever you want to call it, this one's pretty accurate and does more or less sum everything up. But like with many things, there is more nuance and more discussion to be had. So we really do need to dive into this one. The Interior Department is canceling a rule that put conservation on equal footing with development as President Donald Trump's administration eases restrictions on industries and seeks to boost drilling, logging, mining, and grazing on taxpayer owned land. The 2024 rule adopted under former President Joe Biden was meant to refocus the Interior Department's Bureau of Land Management, which oversees about 10% of land in the U.S. It allowed public property to be leased for restoration in the same way that oil companies lease land for drilling. Let's go ahead and take our first pause here because we do need to talk about the rule itself that is being discussed in this article. The rule is the Public Lands Rule, and you'll also see it called the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. So if you actually go look at some of the documentation, just know that Public Lands Rule or Conservation and Landscape Health Rule are more or less interchangeable. It's also true that this rule was put into place to make it official that conservation and restoration are valid uses of public lands on the same level as development, like drilling for oil, mining for minerals, logging, all of those things. And you can actually go confirm all of this by popping on over to the Bureau of Land Management's website. It is currently about 10:30 in the morning on May 13th, 2026 as I'm recording this, and I will be linking this page, but uh, I am skeptical that it's going to continue to exist in perpetuity considering the scrubbing that this administration has done in other areas on government websites. But as of right now, you can look at the page and see the official uh, kind of explanation of this rule. And we'll read it together right now because I do think it's important. The BLM is implementing regulations that will guide balanced management of America's public lands now and for the future. The Conservation and Landscape Health Rule helps safeguard the health of our public lands for current and future generations by ensuring that we protect clean water and wildlife habitat, restore lands and waters that need it, and make informed management decisions based on science, data, and indigenous knowledge. The rule recognizes conservation as an essential component of public lands management on equal footing with other multiple use of these lands. Americans rely on public lands to deliver food, energy, clean air and water, wildlife habitat, and places to recreate. The BLM knows the importance of balancing the use of our natural resources with protecting public lands and water for future generations. The rule will safeguard these lands and waters to protect our way of life. For once, it seems that the article and the actual verbiage and purpose of what the article is talking about are in alignment. You can also go ahead and read the full rule as well. There is a link to the actual document with all the technical language and all of that. And yeah, it more or less says this, but in much more confusing language. So I highly recommend anyone go check that out because the idea of this whole rule was to put in some official writing that conservation and preservation is a valid use of public lands. But let's go ahead and continue on with the article. But Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has said the rule could have blocked access to hundreds of thousands of acres, hectares of land, preventing energy and timber production and hurting ranchers who graze on public lands. Supporters argued that conservation had long been a secondary consideration at the Land Bureau, neglecting its mission under the 1976 Federal Lands Policy Management Act. While the Bureau previously issued leases for conservation purposes in limited cases, it never had a dedicated program prior to the Biden administration. Put a pin in the comment here about Doug Burgum because we will circle back on that a little bit later. But for now, let's talk about that 1976 Federal Lands Policy Management Act because I'm willing to bet that most people are not familiar with it. Of course, I will link the document for the act in my source material in the description, but know that it is about 120 pages long and it has been amended throughout the years, so the amendments are included in the document linked. Now, it does mention conservation, and that is important, but it does primarily deal with the rules around development and things like that, which is honestly not surprising given the time that the act was written and just the everything in the history since then. But it is my opinion that, especially when it comes to preservation and conservation, there is more clarification needed and more official language and official policy and rules about it. Hence, the need for the public lands rule, where conservation and restoration and protection before that rule were not even necessarily considered a use of land, if that makes sense. We'll talk more about that a little bit later as well, but I do think this is something important to note. And if you have the time, go ahead and start digging through the very technical language of the act itself. Perhaps in the future, I would be willing to try to deep dive into it a little bit more, but legal documents like that are not my strong suit at all, but I'd be willing to do it if there is interest. But for now, let's go ahead and get on with the article. Bobby McKinney, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that last name wrong. I have no idea how to pronounce it. I'm doing my best. With the Natural Resources Defense Council said repealing the rule means less protection for the clean drinking water, less protection for endangered wildlife that depend on healthy habitat, and less accountability when corporations leave these landscapes damaged and degraded. In documents released Monday, administration officials said it exceeded the Land Bureau's authority for outside parties to be allowed to obtain conservation leases. Industry groups and their Republican allies in Congress strongly opposed the rule and had lobbied to repeal it. They said the change under Biden violated the multiple use mandate for Interior Department lands by catapulting the non use of federal lands, meaning restoration leases, to a position of prominence. This action provides greater clarity and predictability for independent oil and natural gas producers, many of whom rely on consistent permitting and leasing processes to operate efficiently and invest in domestic energy supply, Dan Natz with the Independent Petroleum Association of America said in a statement. Let's take this moment to make something very clear. Just because land is set aside for conservation and preservation and perhaps restoration, that does not mean that it is in a state of non use. That does not mean it's simply sitting idle. And all of the language being used by those who support the repeal of the rule are heavily emphasizing the idea that land set aside for conservation is land that is not being used, and that is just ludicrous. The benefits of conservation are not simply ecological benefits because there are economical and human health benefits as well, and I feel it's very important for us to talk about that right now, especially when you take into account all of the language in the documentation and being quoted to reporters by those who are involved with this whole getting the public lands rule rescinded debacle. And I'm not even talking about just looking at the documents that were released with the final decision. I am talking about going all the way back to September and looking at the official statement when it was just proposed that they were going to rescind this rule and the public comment period had been opened up. Because in this document, you can see that they're already saying that conservation is no use and kind of trying to equate that if the land's not being used for something like mining, drilling, grazing, yada yada, then it's just not being used. And that's violating the multiple use part of the regulations surrounding public lands. I mean, take a look at this quote from Secretary Doug Burgum. The previous administration's public lands rule had the potential to block access to hundreds of thousands of acres of multiple use land, preventing energy and mineral production, timber management, grazing, and recreation across the West. The most effective caretakers of our federal lands are those whose livelihoods rely on its well being. Overturning this rule protects our American way of life and gives our communities a voice in the land that they depend on. In my opinion, it sounds like this quote was written by Big Oil and Big Timber because it's a pretty poorly kept secret that Doug Burgum is pretty much in bed with the oil industry. If you take a look back at all of his official releases since becoming Secretary of the Interior, you see that he's really pushing for the fossil fuel extraction and logging and all of that on public lands. And then if you go back into his previous political career and personal ties, you'll see that it's all very much intertwined with the fossil fuel industry. But I have a whole video just talking about that, so we don't need to get into it here. But the thing that I'm finding dangerous is that Doug and co are trying to equate this whole idea that land set aside for conservation is just land that's not being used for anything else, when that's just not true. So I know that they keep talking about grazing and recreation, especially. And here's the thing, there are still leases for grazing livestock on public land. That wasn't something that the public land rule was taking away at all. The public land rule was just saying that, yeah, Setting aside land specifically for the purpose of conservation and restoration and protection is a valid use of land. It was adding language that did say this land that's being conserved is part of multi-use because it is being used. It's being used for conservation. And conserving land is important. Conserving land has quite a few benefits. First of all, if we go look at the Land Trust Alliance, they have this little list kind of explaining some of the main bullet points for why protecting your land matters. Now, this particular page is geared more towards private landowners, but it is still applicable because preserving this land does ultimately help provide fresh local food to communities. Now, it may not necessarily be grown on the land itself that is being preserved, but the healthy ecosystem is going to cascade out, and the land surrounding it is going to be healthier as a result. It's going to keep waterways much healthier because, land's being preserved, so it's not being polluted as much, as being taken care of, presumably. Carbon will be stored in the soil and in forests that are preserved, which is kind of a big deal because carbon is one of those big things that is helping to drive the climate change crisis that we are in. But Doug Burgum and most of the Trump administration are skeptics, if not straight up climate change deniers. But that is a soapbox for another day. We need to stay focused here. By preserving and protecting different pieces of land, you're protecting these climate resilient habitat plants that are honestly struggling or starting to struggle in the changing climate, especially if they're being destroyed more and stressed in other ways. And protecting these pieces of land, protecting the environment in these critical areas will allow the plants, which are the base of ecosystems, to adapt without the added stressors of needing to deal with development and things like that and excess pollution. And then protecting land does actually strengthen communities because getting out and being out in nature is good for people, both physically and mentally. And that's not just something people say. Like, you can go and find so many studies talking about it, which is why it's important, because if we lose all of these safe natural areas, then we lose that as well. But you don't have to take the Land Trust Alliance's word for it. How about we pop over to the Fish and Wildlife Service website? And as of right now, it is 10:46 on May 13th, 2026, and this page is still available. Again, I'm pointing that out because this administration has already had a history of scrubbing things that don't align with their values. But this whole article is about why investing in nature is a good thing and the economic benefits of protecting land and water. It does talk about the health benefits. It talks about the clean water. It talks about the benefit to local economies because there are quite a few local economies that depend upon the seasonal uh, economic booms of people getting out there and enjoying these public lands. And it's not just the national parks and national monuments and things, it's also these lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. I know that I've personally gone camping many times on BLM land because sometimes it's a little bit less expensive to camp there than going to a national park, for example. Last time I went to Yosemite, I didn't stay in the park. I stayed in a campsite on some BLM land just outside the Arch Rock entrance, I believe. El Portal. The El Portal entrance. I'm sorry that I lied to you, but I did not mean to, and I fixed it. But it also goes on to talk about protecting these natural environments also protects from uh, the damaging impacts of storms and other natural disasters. And just all of this. We don't have time to read through this article, and honestly, I might go ahead and make another video on it, but just know that even the government websites do not agree with Doug Burgum and co. That protection and conservation of land is beneficial, even if that land is not being used by the oil and gas or logging or mining industries. And also, to say that lands that are being protected are closed to things like grazing and recreation is just false. Because, as I said before, there are leases for ranchers to graze their livestock on public lands, and places that are being protected are still open for people to go hike and camp and things like that. And are there a little bit stricter rules? Yeah, sure. There are assuredly some areas that are completely closed for more intense restoration, but just because a piece of land is being protected doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to utilize it for things like outdoor recreation. That's just a straight up lie from Doug Burgum. But I'm not surprised by that. I'm going to step off this little soapbox and we're going to get back into the article. There's not much left, so we're going to go ahead and read through the last bit of this, and then we're going to talk about some of my other thoughts that aren't even mentioned in this article, but I think are relevant. So let's get back into it. The federal government's vast land holdings are concentrated in western states, including Alaska, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Since taking office, Trump has pursued a flurry of actions aimed at boosting fossil fuel production from those taxpayer owned sites. The Republican administration also has sought to sideline some renewable energy projects, claiming they were unfairly subsidized under Biden. The repeal is effective 30 days after it is published in the Federal Register, which was scheduled for Tuesday. It comes after Republicans in Congress in recent months canceled land management plans adopted in the closing days of Biden's administration that restricted development in large areas of Alaska, Montana, and North Dakota. In addition to its surface land holdings, the Bureau of Land Management regulates publicly owned underground mineral reserves such as coal for power plants and lithium for renewable energy across more than 1 million square miles, 2.5 million square kilometers. The Bureau has a history of industry friendly policies and for more than a century has sold grazing permits and oil and gas leases. If you look back, you will be able to see that it is, in fact, true that the BLM has traditionally been more friendly to industry in general, especially when we look at the cold hard facts, noting that leases that have been sold for conservation's sake have been far and few between, whereas leases for things like oil drilling and grazing are fairly abundant. Of course, we'll have people that disagree, and those people are mainly going to have the argument that regulation is stupid. I know that I'm really boiling it down to its barest bones, but that's the overall theme. But if you do actually look at the facts, you will see that the Bureau of Land Management has more or less been very friendly to industry, and there has legitimately been a need for rules to prop up the conservation side of the mission of the Bureau of Land Management. So let's go ahead and talk about this whole decision to rescind the public lands rule, the rule that did validate the fact that conservation, restoration, and protection are valid uses of lands. Because if you go and actually look at the federal registrar decision about rescinding this rule, you will see that it is very difficult to get to the public comments. Because remember, there was a 60-day public comment period when this rule rescission was initially proposed. I know I commented, and I know other people who did comment as well. So if you go to the actual final decision rule, you'll see under dates, the rule is effective as of June 11th, 2026, so 30 days after it was put on the registrar. If you click the public comment button, which I would think would take me to the actual comments so I could go read through them, it just says comments are no longer being accepted. See dates for details. The only date under dates is the date that this is effective. I don't know if that's normal, but it is something that I found interesting. So you can go through the summary with them talking about rescinding it, with them just saying again that land set aside for conservation and stuff is idle. It's land that is effectively not being used, blah, 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 violates multi-use, all these things that we did talk about earlier. If you scroll down to section 3, the response to public comments, I do find a few things very interesting, because if you read through it, you will think that it was pretty much a 50-50 split between comments that were in favor of rescinding the public lands rule and those opposed to it. But that's not the case. Something seemed fishy to me as soon as I started reading this, but I'm not going to read the whole thing because a lot of it is just them saying the same thing over and over, just in different words. I am going to highlight the first paragraph here because there are some numbers that I want to take a look at. So it says, on September 11th, 2025, the BLM published a notice in the Federal Register proposing to rescind the 2024 rule and initiating a 60-day public comment period on that proposed rule. The public comment period ended on November 10th, 2025. During this comment period, the BLM received 138,161 comment letter submissions, including 129,029 duplicative form letter submissions and 9,132 unique submissions. I want to go ahead and pause there because that seems to me like the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, is justifying not taking into consideration the copy and paste kind of comments that I know a lot of people did use, because a lot of those copy and paste comments give you a good starting point for the issues at hand. But I'm speculating here, it but it does seem to me like this is a justification for them to say, yeah, we got all these comments, but this large percentage of them were all copy and paste, so we're just not going to take them into consideration. Which, if I'm completely honest, I didn't think they were going to take the public comment into consideration anyway. It's just a formality that it seems like they had to go through. But the statement about the content of the comments is vague at best, honestly. Because, like I said, if you continue reading through it, it makes it sound like everything was about 50-50 when it came to support or opposition to this proposal. But if we take a look at that particular breakdown of the like template copy and paste comments versus the unique ones, it's even more concerning, because if the numbers that they report are accurate, they've effectively justified ignoring about 93% of the public comments. And I'm not saying for sure that they did that, but that's how it reads to me, that they were trying to justify that. And I did, of course, go digging, and I did go back to the original proposal, because that is still available and I will link it below. And you can see that there were 61.63K comments that we can look at. And the total comments received were 147,649. I'm not going to read through all those. So I did go ahead and take it to ChatGPT. Now, Yes, I know data centers bad, use AI sparingly, but in this case, I do think that utilizing a tool that realistically is not going to go away was effective here, because when I popped in the link, I was able to get a breakdown because I asked it to break down for me the comments that were in favor versus those opposed, and it did not disappoint. Actually, the first thing that it popped up here was a study or an analysis done by the Center for Western Priorities on November 10th, the morning of, where they took about 43,700 of those comments that were available at the time, and they did analyze them, and they found that about 98% of those comments opposed rescinding the public lands rule, and only about 1.7% were in support, and then there were the like about 0.3% that were neutral or like asking for more time. So that's interesting, especially considering going through the official final decision document where they do make it sound like it was pretty much 50-50, and that's just not the case. But if they were honest that the public is largely against the public lands rule being rescinded, then they would have more explaining to do. Like, asking the question of why? Why, oh, why, Bureau of Land Management and public servants, did you ignore the input from the public? We all know the answer to that question, allegedly, is they care more about the industries filling their pockets than the constituents and the public that they're supposed to be serving. But again, that is all alleged. That is speculation, and I digress. From the breakdown that I did get through ChatGPT, I was also very interested in looking at the nature of the support. So, the opposition to the recession, the support of keeping the public lands rule, and the nature of the opposition to the rule itself, because it does have sources that I did go look at. But overall, the support here is really emphasizing the balance between conservation and extractive uses, that it does need to be balanced, and that providing this rule book for restoration, protection, climate resilience, and all of that is important. And also strengthening those relationships between tribes and the United States government, especially when it comes to managing land. Again, important. And then when you look at the opposition to the rule, it's mainly people talking about industry, resource extraction, and the distaste for elevating conservation to the same level as things like extraction, or one of the points here saying that it elevates conservation above other multiple use priorities, which I disagree. It put it on the same playing field, but we all know how people will see something being raised up to the level of something else and saying, oh no, now I have less. But in reality, nothing was taken. But I digress. So, all in all, this decision is not surprising to me. Like I said, I did not think that they were going to take public comment into account anyway, especially considering the fact that over 90% of public commenters were in favor of keeping the public lands rule and opposed rescinding it. But the thing that genuinely shocked me was the at least implied justification for ignoring the comments of thousands of people because they happen to be those copy and paste template comments. And that is very concerning, because I do know a lot of people do enjoy using those templates to help get their thoughts out and sound more articulate. Because if you go into those comments just sounding angry, they also don't take them seriously. But moving forward, this seems to me like the template comments are something that our officials are going to throw out. Now, that is me speculating. Again, I'm not trying to fearmonger or anything like that, but I do think it is important to think about these things. And perhaps in the future, as we comment on things, it's good to have a template bullet point thing, but we should probably be trying to put everything into our own words so they can't say, oh, 93% of the comments were all copy and paste. Only 9,000 of the nearly 200,000 we got were even unique. Because I do know that the next step is, oh, then they're just bots submitting them. They did not say that. This is just me speculating. Please remember that. But I don't want us to leave feeling nothing but doom and gloom here, because I very much think that it is never a time to give up hope, that it's never too late to have hope. So I do have a little bit of a call to action. If you want to fight back against things like this, then call your representatives. Midterms are coming up this year. Remember what you care about as you go to vote. Be very careful about who you are voting for, not just at the national level, but also at the more local levels as well. Real change tends to start local and then spread outwards. This is a very critical time for us. So do your research as you're thinking about who to give your vote to. Call your representatives now. Let them know how you feel about the public lands rule being rescinded. These are the things that we can do. I know it feels frustrating and it feels like we're doing these things constantly, because we are. But the game has particular rules and we need to operate within those rules. I know it's frustrating. I'm frustrated too. But we can also make sure we're supporting organizations like the NRDC and the Sierra Club and organizations that are going to assuredly sue the government over things like this. I predict that that is likely going to happen here, because that has been happening every step of the way during this administration. So again, support organizations like the NRDC, the National Parks Conservation Association, the Center for Biological Diversity, the Sierra Foundation, all of those places, because they're getting out there and doing the work. But no matter what, do not give up hope. That's all I have for you guys today. I know this was kind of a long one. This one may seem like a bit of a bummer, but please, like I said, do not give up hope. Please continue contacting your representatives. Please support the organizations that are doing the work with the boots on the ground out there. Together, we can get through all of this. Together, we can make a better tomorrow. I do genuinely believe that. And I know that I, for one, won't be silenced until silence is thrust upon me. So I'm going to encourage you to also follow suit if it's safe for you to do so. Of course, we all do what we can within our own personal capacities. But in the very least, pop a comment down in the comment section below. What was your comfort drink today? I would like to know. I was just having coffee with some hazelnut creamer, but I'm also partial to a nice Earl Grey tea with a little bit of milk and sugar. But I'm always open to trying new things. Also, if you found anything of value in this video, I'd really appreciate you giving it a like and maybe even sharing this one out. Also, if you want to see more of me and my content recommended to you, I promise it's not always a bummer like this. Please consider clicking that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. And I will take this moment to wish you a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one.